April 1945. Europe was a continent on fire. Towns lay in ruins, skies blackened by smoke, and the ground itself trembled under the final convulsions of a dying empire. Nazi Germany was collapsing from within, its armies scattered, its cities bombed to ash, its leaders either dead, fleeing, or hiding in bunkers that stank of oil and fear. On the Eastern Front, entire divisions were dissolving overnight. Soldiers burned their uniforms, buried their weapons, and vanished into forests, hoping the Red Army would pass them by. Among them was a 6-year-old gunner named Heinrich Adler, a farmer's son from Bavaria whose world had been consumed by the Reich's war. He'd survived the carnage of Stalingrad, the retreat through Poland, and the endless winter marches that killed men faster than bullets. But as his unit fell back toward the Czech border, something inside Heinrich finally broke. He'd seen too much villages burned to the ground, civilians executed in ditches, boys no older than 16 sent to die for a cause already lost. The chain of command had disintegrated. Officers barked orders, no one followed. The men were starving, scavenging for food in abandoned barns. When the Soviets launched another offensive that April, Heinrich's company was caught in the open, pinned down by artillery and strafing aircraft. In the chaos, he grabbed his MG-42, a small satchel of rations, and fled west. To the others, it looked like desertion. To him, it was survival. By nightfall, the front line was gone, swallowed by fire and retreating soldiers. Heinrich kept walking, guided only by instinct and the faint promise of home hundreds of kilometers away. 3 days later, his commanding officer filed the report. Adler, Heinrich missing, presumed dead. In the dying weeks of the war, that phrase was everywhere, stamped across thousands of names, each one another ghost swallowed by the smoke of history. But Heinrich Adler's story didn't end there. His would disappear deeper than anyone imagined, far from the battlefields, beneath a silence that would last half a century. The last man to see Heinrich Adler alive was Corporal Franz Metzger, who later told investigators he'd spotted him just before dawn walking alone down a muddy track outside the bombed village of Kuti, rifle slung over his shoulder, the satchel bouncing against his back. He looked calm, almost detached, as if the war around him no longer existed. Beyond the village lay a stretch of dense Bohemian forest, shrouded in mist, its trees twisted and dark from artillery fire. That's where Heinrich was heading. Metzger assumed he was scouting for food or shelter. But when the unit regrouped hours later, Adler was gone. His machine gun, his rations, his papers, everything he carried vanished with him. Days later, Allied troops swept through the area, leaving nothing but charred tanks and empty trenches. The forest was searched briefly, then abandoned. Too many men were missing, too many bodies unaccounted for. Heinrich became another name on another list. When the war finally ended in May, his family in Bavaria received a letter written in bureaucratic coldness. Your son, Heinrich Adler, presumed missing in action near the Bohemian border. His mother lit a candle on the farmhouse table that night, waiting for a knock that never came. His brother Karl took over the fields, rebuilt the barn, and learned to live with the silence that had settled over their land. For years, rumors circulated through nearby villages. Some said deserters had fled into the forest and were shot by patrols. Others whispered of soldiers who hid in caves, living like ghosts long after peace was declared. But no one ever found proof. For Heinrich Adler, there was no grave, no witness, no closure. Only the faint memory of a man walking into the trees while the world around him burned, and a mystery buried so deep it would take nearly 50 years for the ground itself to give up his secret. The war ended, but the silence it left behind was louder than any explosion. By the 1950 seconds, Bavaria was rebuilding itself from rubble and ash. Fields once cratered by bombs bloomed again with wheat and barley. The Adler farm, tucked between rolling hills outside Passau, had survived the war by some quiet miracle. The old farmhouse still stood, its roof patched with mismatched tiles, its walls scarred but sturdy. When Heinrich never returned, his younger brother Karl took over the land. He was practical, stoic, the kind of man who didn't talk about grief because work left no time for it. Each morning, he rose before dawn, milked the cows, and watched the mist roll over the valley. But some nights, when the wind was still and the world seemed to hold its breath, Carl swore he heard something beneath the barn, soft knocks, faint scraping, the echo of movement. He blamed rats. Maybe stray cats. He'd tell himself that as he bolted the cellar door and went back to bed, listening to the quiet stretch on like an unanswered question. In 1956, during a renovation to expand the storage cellar, Carl bricked off an old section of the foundation that had begun to sag inward. The space was narrow and damp, barely large enough to crawl through. It smelled of soil and mildew, like something ancient and forgotten. He sealed it quickly, eager to finish before the next rain. When the final brick went in, he paused, hearing a sound he couldn't quite place, a hollow thump, like air escaping from the earth. Then silence. The wall stayed sealed for decades. Carl rarely spoke of his brother. The official letter declaring Heinrich missing, presumed dead, remained tucked in a drawer beneath old tax papers, yellowing with time. Visitors sometimes asked if any of the Adlers had fought in the war. Carl would nod, offer a vague answer, and change the subject. The fields thrived, the animals multiplied, and the farm endured. But under its foundations, the ground held a secret, one even the family who lived above it didn't know. Was there a secret that waited patiently in the cold, dark earth for someone to find it? 18 years after the war, the world had moved on. West Germany was an economic miracle, its cities pulsing with life and neon. But in a dusty office in Bonn, where old military files were kept in tall metal cabinets, a historian named Dr. Otto Kessler was sifting through the past. He was cataloging missing Wehrmacht personnel, verifying which cases could finally be closed. Most files were routine men lost in Russia, soldiers buried in unmarked graves. Then he came across one marked Adler, Heinrich. It was thin, barely a few pages. Service record, date of birth, last known unit. Nothing unusual except for a handwritten note at the bottom. Last seen carrying rations and entrenching tools. Kessler frowned. Entrenching tools were shovels, equipment for digging. Digging what and where? He flagged it briefly, then set it aside. There were too many names, too many mysteries, and not enough answers. The file gathered dust again, filed under A like all the others. But in the region where Heinrich had vanished, stories refused to die. Locals spoke of a ghost soldier seen wandering the woods on moonless nights, a man in a torn uniform carrying a rifle without bullets. Hunters claimed to find footprints in mud that led nowhere, or hear muffled coughing deep among the trees. Most dismissed it as legend, a haunting leftover from a war that refused to let go. Yet every few years, someone would swear they'd seen him, a pale figure near the edge of the forest, looking toward the valley as if searching for home. They said the soldier never spoke, only stared, before fading into the mist. No one connected the stories to the name in Kessler's file. No one realized that the man they called a ghost had never left at all. Beneath the fields of Bavaria, beneath a simple farm and its sealed cellar wall, Heinrich Adler was still there, waiting in silence for the world to remember. By the early 1992, the Adler farm was no longer an Adler farm at all. Carl had died without children, and after years of neglect, the property was auctioned off, barn sagging, roof collapsing, the fields overrun with weeds. When Matthias and Lena Fischer first saw it in the spring of 1991, they didn't see decay, they saw potential. He was a carpenter from Munich. She a teacher with a dream of running a countryside bed and breakfast. Together they imagined restoring the old farmhouse to its former warmth, fresh plaster, a red roof, wooden beams gleaming in the sunlight. The barn, Matthias decided, would become a guest house, complete with rustic charm and modern plumbing. Locals told them the place had history, though none could say exactly what kind. The older villagers lowered their voices when the Adlers were mentioned, muttering about the brother who vanished, and things best left buried. But Matthias was a practical man. Ghost stories didn't bother him. He was more concerned about old wiring, wood rot, and the smell of damp straw that clung to the beams. By autumn, the renovation was underway. Workers cleared decades of dust and debris, hauling out rusted tools, broken crates, and animal bones. The deeper they dug, the stranger things became. Beneath the cracked concrete floor of the barn, they uncovered a section that looked out of place, smooth, pale gray, poured in a clean rectangle that didn't match the original stone foundation. The edges were sharp, deliberate. "Maybe a repair job," Matthias said, crouching to inspect it. But Lena noticed something else. The patch was colder to the touch, even though the rest of the floor was warm from the sun. "It's newer," she said quietly. "Someone did this long after the barn was built." That night, she dreamed of footsteps echoing under the floorboards. When she woke, Matthias was already downstairs, staring at the strange patch in the dawn light. He couldn't explain it, but something about that slab of concrete unsettled him. It didn't belong there. The drilling started on a gray morning in late October. Rain had soaked the fields outside, and the workers were eager to finish before the weather turned worse. Matthias had hired a local contractor to check the foundation before laying pipes for the guest house. The man, a veteran builder named Kruger, ran his hand along the concrete patch and frowned. "This isn't farm work," he muttered. "Too clean, too deliberate." He set the drill against the surface, and within seconds the bit screeched, hitting something hard metal, not stone. The sound echoed through the barn like a scream. Everyone froze. "Could be a drainage cover," Kruger said, but his voice lacked conviction. They chipped away the concrete until a small square outline emerged, an iron hatch sealed with 4 rusted bolts. It looked old, older than the renovation but younger than the barn itself, like someone had hidden it intentionally. When they pried at the bolts, a foul, stale air hissed out, thick with the smell of earth and something else decay. Matthias stepped back, covering his nose. Lena stood in the doorway, watching as the men wrestled the hatch open. Below yawned a narrow shaft, leading down into blackness. A flashlight beam revealed timber supports, dirt walls, and the suggestion of a chamber beyond. "What the hell is this?" Kruger whispered. Matthias thought of the stories, the missing soldier, the ghost in the woods, and for the first time, they didn't sound like superstition. He called the police. Within the hour, the farm was swarming with uniforms. The local inspector, a stout man named Berger, peered into the darkness and declared it a wartime bunker, probably sealed after 1945. "Old hideout, maybe," he said, though his tone wavered as another gust of that sour air drifted up. The officers lowered a camera through the opening. The image that flickered on the monitor was grainy but unmistakable timber walls, rotted canvas, and something slumped against the far side of the chamber. Something human. The police descended first, flashlights cutting through the stale dark like thin blades of light. The opening was barely wide enough for one man at a time. Timber beams framed the shaft, hand-cut and blackened with age. As the first investigator dropped to the dirt floor below, a cloud of dust and cobwebs exploded upward, filling the barn with the smell of earth that hadn't breathed in decades. The chamber was small, no more than 3 meters across, but meticulously constructed. Wooden braces held up the ceiling. Rusted nails protruded from the walls where tools once hung. In one corner lay a metal crate with faded stenciling German words barely legible through the corrosion. "MG munition," a military ammo box. The officer opened it with gloved hands. Inside were disintegrated cloth belts, the remains of machine gun rounds, long turned to rust. Another beam of light swept across the far wall, and that's when they saw it. A weapon propped upright against the timber, a corroded MG-42, the standard machine gun of the Wehrmacht. Its barrel was eaten by rust, but its silhouette was unmistakable, frozen in time like a relic of war waiting to be reclaimed. Beside it sat something that made every man fall silent. Against the wall, seated on a low stool of rotting wood, was the skeleton of a man. His boots still clung to the bones of his feet, leather blackened and cracked. A uniform jacket folded neatly beside him bore the faded eagle and swastika insignia of a German gunner. Resting on the uniform was a small notebook, its pages curled but intact, bound with a strip of twine. The officer's flashlight lingered on the skull, the jaw slightly open, as if caught mid-breath. "He was sitting when he died," one of them whispered. The walls around him told the rest of the story. Shelves stacked with empty tins, glass bottles, a lantern long extinguished. Above his head, a crude ventilation pipe climbed toward the barn, camouflaged among the beams. Whoever he was, he had planned to stay hidden for a long time. As the team photographed the chamber, one officer murmured, "He didn't die in battle. He died, waiting." On the dirt floor, the diary glimmered faintly under a thin layer of dust, waiting for someone to read what was written inside. The diary's cover was cracked and brittle, the paper yellowed but still legible under careful light. Each entry was written in pencil-tight, slanted handwriting that spoke of discipline or desperation. The first page was dated the 8th of May, 1945, the day Germany surrendered. "They say the war is over," it began, "but I can still hear it in the distance. I cannot go back. I cannot face what waits beyond these trees." The writer was unmistakably Heinrich Adler. He described fleeing through the forest after his unit collapsed, hiding during the day, moving only at night. He scavenged from abandoned homes and supply depots until he reached the edge of familiar land, his family's farm, empty and silent. The Soviets were advancing from the east, American patrols sweeping from the west. Caught between both, Heinrich dug downward. Using a stolen entrenching tool, he carved out a refuge beneath the barn where he'd once played as a boy. Over the following weeks, he reinforced it with wood scavenged from broken fences, camouflaged the entrance beneath the floorboards, and lined the walls with tar paper to keep the damp out. He wrote about hearing footsteps above him, muffled voices, farmers returning, or soldiers searching. He didn't dare show himself. "If they find me," he wrote, "I am a prisoner. If they don't, I am free." His supplies dwindled quickly: dried bread, tinned meat, melted snow. At night, he crept out through a narrow crawlspace to steal potatoes or fill his canteen from the well. But the isolation began to change him. The later entries grew frantic, scattered. He spoke of dreams where he saw his comrades' faces in the dirt walls, of whispers coming through the floorboards. Still, he kept digging, expanding his underground shelter until it became a labyrinth of survival and guilt. The final dated entry, the 12th of January 1947, was written in a trembling hand. "The snow is heavy this year. The house above me sleeps. I have food for one more week. The war is gone, but it still lives in me. I think I'll rest soon." After that, the pages were blank except for smudged fingerprints and a single pencil mark trailing off the page. Heinrich Adler had outlived the war by 2 years, but not his ghosts. The deeper investigators read into Heinrich's diary, the more the words unraveled. The early entries were orderly, practical, a soldier, cataloging his supplies, recording days and weather, calculating how long he could survive. But as months passed, the handwriting changed. Lines slanted, sentences broke mid-thought. Sometimes he wrote entire paragraphs twice, as if he'd forgotten what he'd already said. The tone shifted from survival to fear. "They're above me," one entry read. "Sometimes one voice, sometimes many. I can't tell what language they speak." Another page mentioned boots pacing across the barn floor, pausing over the very spot where he hid. He convinced himself soldiers were searching for him, even years after the war had ended. "They want me to come out," he wrote. "They call my name. Sometimes I answer." Later entries hinted at hunger and hallucination. He described rationing moldy bread, catching mice that wandered too close. In one haunting passage, he wrote that he heard his mother's voice singing from the farmhouse kitchen, though she'd been dead for years. The line that followed was barely legible. "She says dinner is ready. I can smell it. But if I go upstairs, it disappears." By 1946, Heinrich's notes blurred the boundary between memory and madness. He believed the forest itself was whispering to him through the vents, warning him not to leave. "The trees are watching," one line read, "and they remember what I've done." His thoughts spiraled inward, turning on themselves like a snake devouring its tail. Then came the final page, scrawled across torn paper, the pencil pressed so hard it nearly ripped through. They're walking above me again. I can't tell if they're real. If I go out, they'll find me. If I stay, I vanish. After that, nothing. No more words, no more dates, just silence, and the empty pages that followed, yellowed and blank, like the airless void he'd lived in. The investigators closed the notebook with trembling hands. The man they had found beneath the farm had not died in combat. He had died in exile from a war that ended everywhere but inside his mind. Forensic teams worked through the night under the pale glow of halogen lamps. Every artifact, every scrap of paper, every bone was catalogued with precision. The DNA analysis confirmed what history had already suggested: the remains belonged to Heinrich Adler, the missing gunner whose name had been marked presumed dead nearly half a century earlier. His bones were fragile, the joints showing signs of severe malnutrition. Around him lay the remnants of a life reduced to survival: rusted ration tins stamped here, a dented kettle blackened by soot, Wehrmacht documents sealed in waxed paper, and a handful of family photographs pinned to the dirt wall with nails. The images were faded but recognizable: a woman, 2 children, a dog in a wheat field. His handwriting covered the backs of some in pencil: home, before, forgive me. On one shelf, investigators found a small oil lantern, still half full, and beside it, the cracked remains of a mirror. It had been propped against the far wall, directly across from where Heinrich's body sat. The glass was broken clean down the center, one half reflecting the earthen ceiling, the other half tilted toward the skeletal remains. "He must have looked at himself until the end," said Inspector Berger quietly. The air in the chamber hung heavy with dust and sorrow. Even the most seasoned officers spoke in whispers, as if afraid to disturb the quiet that had protected this secret for so long. The bunker wasn't just a shelter, it was a tomb built by its occupant, a confession carved out of soil. As evidence bags filled and the last photographs were taken, one investigator paused to stare into that broken mirror. The fractured glass caught the light just enough to show a reflection not of the skeleton, but of the living men standing in his place. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Berger said what everyone was thinking. He didn't hide from the world, he hid from himself. Upstairs, the wind creaked through the old barn rafters. The farm, silent for decades, finally exhaled. The discovery beneath the Adler farm became the focus of an intense investigation that blended archaeology, history, and tragedy. Forensic anthropologists from Munich arrived within days, mapping every inch of the chamber. The soil composition told a story as detailed as any diary. Beneath layers of compacted earth, they found traces of ash and charcoal, proof that Heinrich had built a small stove vented through narrow metal pipes leading upward into the barn. At first glance, the pipes looked like drainage tubes from an old irrigation system, but their alignment told a different tale. They had been carefully hidden behind support beams, camouflaged with mud and straw, carrying smoke up through the barn floor where it dispersed unnoticed. He had been cooking beneath the earth, burning bits of wood and straw to heat water or warm his hands during brutal winters. The bunker's walls, reinforced with scavenged planks, still held fragments of canvas and wax paper, insulation improvised from whatever scraps he could find. On one side, etched faintly into the dirt wall, was a series of tally marks, dozens of them, carved with a knife, each one marking a day survived. Counting backward from the last entry in the diary, investigators determined the final marks stopped in late 1947. By then, his rations had long since run out. Chemical analysis of the remains revealed dehydration and severe malnutrition. He had starved slowly, his body consuming itself while his mind slipped further into delusion. There were no signs of violence, no forced entry, no struggle, just stillness. Local historians pieced together the broader timeline. Heinrich had likely fled to the farm in spring 1945, dug the shelter during the summer, and managed to survive off stolen crops, small animals, and rainwater for nearly 2 years. The handwriting in his diary changed season by season, from steady in 1945 to trembling in 1947, mirroring the slow disintegration of a man trapped between guilt and survival. What shocked the experts most wasn't how he lived, but how long he endured. He was within walking distance of safety, one researcher said. The war was over, but in his mind it never stopped. The hideout was sealed again after documentation, a monument to one man's self-imposed purgatory. The earth that had hidden Heinrich Adler for half a century finally told his story, and it was one of quiet, endless suffering. When news of the discovery broke, it spread across Germany like wildfire. Newspapers called it the soldier beneath the farm. Television crews descended on the small Bavarian village, their bright lights cutting through morning fog as reporters stood before the barn that had become a national obsession. Who was Heinrich Adler? A coward who abandoned his comrades, or a broken man who simply couldn't return to the world above? Psychologists saw him as an early case of what modern medicine calls post-traumatic stress, an untreated wound of the mind long before the term existed. His diary revealed flashes of lucidity drowned in guilt. He wrote about civilians executed in Belarus, about orders he followed but never understood, about the faces that haunted him each night in the dark. I can still hear the crying. One entry read, "I don't remember who gave the command, only that I obeyed." He wasn't running from the Soviets anymore. He was running from what he'd seen and what he'd done. Historians debated whether his isolation was punishment or penance. Some argued he'd chosen the earth as his confessional, burying himself to escape judgment. Others saw him as one of thousands young men devoured by a war that ended on paper but never in the human mind. A televised panel quoted one expert saying, "Heinrich Adler's grave is not a symbol of cowardice, it's a mirror of conscience." Survivors of the era wrote letters to the local paper, some condemning him, others sympathizing. "He hid because he couldn't face what he'd become," one reader wrote. Another said, "Maybe he stayed hidden because the world outside wasn't worth returning to." The debate only grew louder, but beneath it all, one truth lingered. Heinrich wasn't hunted by armies or governments. He was haunted by himself. His war didn't end with the fall of Berlin, it ended 2 years later, in silence, under a Bavarian barn where a man tried to bury both his sins and his sorrow. For months after the discovery, Heinrich Adler's name drifted through headlines, documentaries, and academic journals. His story seemed closed, tragic, but complete until a retired Soviet archivist named Viktor Chernov contacted German authorities with something unexpected. While cataloging old NKVD files in Minsk, Chernov had found a folder labeled Operation Frostlight 1945. Inside were interrogation notes, arrest warrants, and lists of German officers wanted for war crimes committed in occupied Belarus. Among them was a familiar name, Heinrich Adler, machine gunner, 2nd Battalion, 215th Infantry Division. The document accused him of involvement in an operation that razed a village called Novaya Rudnya, execution of civilians, destruction of property, the deaths of 47 people. The NKVD never captured him. His name was circled in red, beside the word "Ishez" vanished. The revelation reignited every debate surrounding his legacy. Historians pored over the documents, matching them with Wehrmacht records and unit positions. The evidence was circumstantial, but damning. Adler's division had indeed operated in the area at that time. His signature even appeared on a requisition form recovered from the same region. Was this the same man who spent 2 years entombed under his family's farm, starving in the dark? Was he fleeing justice, not trauma? The diary offered no direct answer. It contained no mention of Belarus, no confession, no acknowledgement of specific crimes. But between the lines, between prayers, dreams, and words like "forgive me," scholars found echoes of something unspoken. One historian noted a chilling pattern. In the diary, Heinrich often referred to himself in the third person, writing "he did this" or "the gunner remembers." It was as if he couldn't bear to use his own name when recalling certain memories. Whether the NKVD file was accurate or not, it shifted the story's gravity. He was no longer simply a lost soldier. He might have been a fugitive who buried himself beneath the soil he once called home. "Maybe the bunker wasn't just a hiding place," said a television commentator. "Maybe it was his prison and he was both inmate and guard." The idea unsettled everyone who had once pitied him. The man in the dark had fled from more than war. He might have been running from his own past, from crimes that time could bury but conscience never could. The Adler family learned of the Soviet documents from the news. Until then, they had embraced the story of Heinrich as a symbol of tragedy, a man broken by war, not a perpetrator of it. His great-niece, Elise, who had overseen the reburial process, described the revelation as a second death. Yet even in the face of accusation, the family chose dignity over denial. "We cannot rewrite what he did," Elise said at a small press conference, her voice trembling, "but we can acknowledge it and ensure it is remembered honestly." Heinrich's remains were reburied in the village cemetery, marked not by military honors but by a simple stone engraved with his name and the years 1919, 1947. Below, a single line read, Suchte Frieden, aber fand ihn zu spät. He sought peace, but found it too late. The ceremony was quiet. No speeches, no uniforms, just a handful of relatives and villagers standing beneath a gray Bavarian sky. The diary, however, had taken on a life of its own. Preserved by historians, it was placed on permanent display at the German Historical Museum in Berlin, under glass beside Heinrich's rusted MG-42 and the cracked mirror found in the bunker. Visitors filed past in silence, reading his words, some written with clarity, others smeared by time and trembling hands. Next to the display, a wall invited people to leave notes. Some wrote messages of forgiveness, understanding that a generation of young men had been shaped by propaganda and fear. Others wrote in anger, calling him a murderer, a coward who chose to hide rather than atone publicly. The curators didn't remove any of the messages. Together they formed a collage of judgment, empathy, and reflection, proof that history's weight still pressed on the living. Years later, a historian would call the Adler case Germany's unfinished eulogy. It was neither absolution nor condemnation, but something in between, a nation still learning how to mourn its ghosts. And though the farmhouse was eventually restored and the bunker sealed forever, people said the air around it felt different, quieter, as if the earth itself had exhaled after keeping its secret for half a century. In the years that followed, the Adler farm returned to life. Wheat swayed in the fields again, cows grazed lazily under the Bavarian sun, and the new owners, descendants of no one from the old story, spoke of the land's fertility, its peace. Tourists came to take photographs of the restored barn, unaware of what once lay beneath their feet. The earth, disturbed and resealed, kept its quiet dignity. Yet those who knew could never quite look at it the same way. They said the wind that crossed the valley sometimes sounded like a sigh, and that in certain light the ground seemed to breathe. The world had moved on. Germany rebuilt. Generations were born free from the shadows of their grandfathers, and the war that once scorched Europe became a collection of dates in history books. But for those who touched Heinrich Adler's story, for the investigators who descended into the soil, for the family who faced his truth, for the strangers who stood before his diary in Berlin, the past didn't feel distant. It felt alive, coiled beneath the surface like a root that refused to die. Because war never truly ends. It burrows deep, hiding not just in fields and forests, but in memory, in the guilt we inherit, in the silence we keep. Beneath the farm's thriving life lies the story of one man who could not return to the surface, who dug himself into darkness, believing it would offer peace, only to find a different kind of prison. His story lingers not as a warning or a lesson, but as a reflection of what happens when conscience becomes its own battlefield. Each spring, the fields above bloom wild, with poppies red as blood, fragile as breath. Locals call them the soldiers' flowers, though few remember which soldier they mean. The barn stands quiet now, its wooden beams humming faintly in the wind. Beneath it, sealed forever, rests the chamber where Heinrich Adler wrote his last words, where war ended for the world but not for him. When the war ended for everyone else, Heinrich Adler kept fighting not against armies, but against the ghosts buried within him. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.